spring. So I did want to go through some of our current staffing ratios with some Dane County comparisons. Our recommendation right now from central office to head towards that difficult budget vote in June and some timelines related to that work. So I do think it's valuable for the board to know where we sit in terms of our Dane County comparables. Mainly, this is the hiring environment has never been really, we've never seen anything like this in K-12 education. More than anything, Rochelle on a daily basis having applicants from area districts that are considering their own area school district, and certainly our superintendent plays into this. The mission and vision of our school district plays in, our facilities play in, but class size and competition, class size and our compensation also play into folks who are considering becoming a Verona area school district staff member. Those are all things that so I do think it's it would be good for the board to just have an idea of where we sit. So as a reminder, if we were heading in a direction of an $800,000 goal with a year of service, we would have some work ahead of us. And the majority of our budget goes towards paying people. 80% of our budget goes towards paying people. And I just thought the board should know the number we're using all in salary benefits is about $80,000 a person in terms of our budget. So the math gets pretty easy in terms of the number of FTE we have to start to talk about in terms of cuts. And I don't think the board's been interested in that. If we started to close that gap or started to try to figure out a way to get up to CPI. A quick run around the county and kind of where we stack up against our Dane County peers. So you'll see here, this is a staffing ratio of straight up students to DPI certified teaching staff. And yeah, you can see we're towards the upper third of that, but I think in line with our Dane County peers in terms of what our staffing ratios would be. This likely gets, quite frankly, a little bit worse in the short term if we're not adding staff in line with our student enrollment. And I think that is potentially one of the things we would share with our community in the event the board decided to head in the direction of an operating referendum, that it would be our goal to do what we can to continue to keep class sizes reasonable and reasonable compared to Dane County comparables. So the county average is about 3.3. Madison weighs into that, and they're kind of an outlier at 12.1, and we're at 13.9 in terms of average number of teachers per student.
Students per teacher.
Students per teacher. Thank you for that. Much different number. Next, we wanted to just take a look at average salary, and we got a good question from a board member previewing these slides. This is a number worth looking at, but there are other ways to kind of cover this up. So right now, our average salary is slightly above the county average. There are some school districts that are higher, and obviously some that are lower. So our average salary is just above $56,000 a year. The county average is just about $55,000. There is an outlier here in Madison, and quite frankly, there are times we are competing with our area school districts for highly qualified staff members, and in many cases, highly qualified diverse staff members in line with kind of our hiring mission for this district. And I think that does weigh in here, and we can potentially get this if we do a little bit more digging, is kind of the tenure of our staff members. So if a school district has recently had, over a 4 or 5, 10 year period of time, a decent number of retirements, and they're hiring first, second, fifth year teachers, their average is going to go down, and vice versa. If you've got longer tenured staff members, your average will go up. But that is straight up average salary for our teachers. Next, ratio in terms of where we're at, students to all of our staff. So number of students divided all in, that includes, all of our support staff, district-wide. And again, we went up just towards that upper third. County average is 5.7. Again, Madison is an outlier, pulling that average down, but we're at 7.7. You can see there are, I consider Forest a solid comparable to the Northern Area School District at 8.2. We're definitely in the ballpark. We're on the higher side in terms of our staffing ratio. You want to give the board a quick update in terms of what we'll be doing over the next month. Again, it is our recommendation tonight for late, kind of mid-winter, early spring, that Michelle, the academic and the student services teams, that they begin conversations with principals around staffing our buildings with no new additional FTE. Because really what we would be doing would be handcuffing the board. If I was here tonight and said, we need 15 new FTE. Trust us, we'll figure out a way to pay for it come June. All of you just saw the math on that. That's $80,000 in FTE without a $5 million budget gap. All of a sudden, we start staffing buildings like that. Rochelle doesn't have some postings in March. We hire folks on, and then we have to pay for it come June when we have to pass the preliminary budget. So my recommendation tonight in the short term is to start working at a plan where we don't add any FTE district-wide. There will certainly be times in line with what the slide says, we're going to apply an FTE-based staffing approach that we're going to look at the entire district. And if there's a building that has really small class sizes at a grade level, and another one that has big ones, there's a chance we're going to start to move some of that FTE around the district in line with student needs. And we can do activity-based staffing all day long. It doesn't mean you have to add a bunch of FTE. It means you're taking a really hard look at making sure that the resources we have are being put in the right direction. All right. A quick update on our timeline. Here we sit on the doorstep of February. We will get the board an update, a little bit of class side guidance and process update at our next board meeting. We will release those workbooks to principals in middle February. They'll have a couple of weeks to work their way through in terms of who's teaching what. This exercise kind of gets exponentially more difficult as you get up into the levels. Where the elementary school is, it's still complicated, but not really what it's like to staff our buildings at our high school when it's content specific in terms of who's teaching what. Then we've got a week towards the end of February where HR will be meeting with principals and all of our directors around the plan that's in place, just kind of work with principals and make sure we've got it straight. And then HR will put up a mass posting on March 1st in line with how we ended up doing this. All right. Any questions on staffing in particular, or anything else I mentioned in the last middle third of this presentation?
Taking some time to digest this. This is a lot of information.
Again, to leave any piece of this book tonight, the conversation we're going to have right now would be, I think we all need to kind of work on this.
This gets very clear like that. So thank you very much. Board, are there any questions that you have before we move forward?
Yeah, I have another question. You said that your recommendation is to move forward in the short term with staffing neutral on FTEs. If we weren't in budget considerations, what would our predictions for new FTEs be?
Yeah, so there's
I know it's hard to tell.
Yeah,
retirements haven't come in yet.
Exactly. There are, I think, a variety of factors that can go into that. Number one, if we were picking up through at least our initial work and results policies, that we felt there was a need for additional FTE that did currently exist in our district and wanted to student needs. We had that conversation just around the ad related to student needs and results. And then if you just kind of work your way through, we're at about 13 teachers, 13 students per teacher. And we're projecting to pick up another 100 kids next year. So the simple math on that would probably be, somewhere in the ballpark of 6 or 7 staff members just to account for that added number of students. And those would be spread out. We have a decent number of schools, so we don't feel it. That's where you hit the bubble that we were at a slightly uncomfortable level at a second grade class. We did allocate an additional teacher this year. We contacted the second grade class in math. This year we have at least in the short term, we have some tighter scenarios.
I have a question as well. Okay, great. So as we look at this, you mentioned with the staff neutral plan, it's possible that some of our classes could get a little bit bigger or some changes could happen. As we think about COVID, which is not going anywhere anytime soon, and thinking about increasing our classroom sizes, potentially, how does that impact our mitigation strategies, keeping our classes open and our communities when we're asking about keeping our schools open? So how does this kind of conflict with that?
Well, I think it will mean the work we're doing over the next month will be all in one work to make sure that we have we're making the most of the activity we have. There are some outliers in our district this year where we have slightly smaller class sizes that I think we can make an adjustment next year to right size that a little bit more in terms of where our district's at. I also think it does play into almost a segue for the next conversation, where if we can limp our way through for the next 6 to 8 months, that this is certainly something we are going to explore and operate in referendum would be one of the things we share with our community. Not only the science that goes behind making sure you keep class sizes reasonable for student achievement, but also in the short term, just making sure we got space in our classrooms to be safe.
Also, just wanted to quickly reiterate our stance on that I don't want the community on board to visualize tech classes, but that's not what we are making, that's not what our budget would infer or significantly small ones than we think about the purpose of using those spaces, class sizes that are already in space that's mutually conducive to good instruction, and we will get
And that clarity to that point, if we pick up another 100 students for next year, that is spread across classrooms where we have 5,600 students already. So that might mean another student or two at a given grade level, a given building, spread all the way across our district. It isn't necessarily sustainable to be staffing neutral, but in the interim and short term, with really dependent unforeseen circumstances with $0 increase and a giant CPI hanging out there, it is our way of at least having a stop that thing.
Can I ask one more question? So I completely understand the budget need for staffing neutral, the way you're describing it. I'm just thinking, for example, of a recent meeting we had with the P program, and there were parents of students who are going up to high school, just concerned about staffing of a program that's moving up into a new space and is requiring staff, for example, bilingual staff that maybe weren't necessary before because we didn't have to be in high school. So how would you explain how to do the staffing neutral approach, but still having a program like that might have new requirements? Is that going to be served by the fact that some staff might retire, or you explained that there might be shifts, but maybe you just elaborate a little bit on how that would.
Yeah, the next few months will certainly allow us to play that out. That's part of the reason I said for the time being, we're moving forward with the staffing neutral plan. So I think Christina start, and I did this for 10 years at High School. To start, one way to think of this is that you have a cohort of students going and they're taking TWE or dual language social studies. We have 24 students taking freshman dual language social studies. Those students aren't taking our standard offer of 9th grade social studies. They're taking one that's in a dual language setting. So then it's not an FTE issue, it's a certification issue. That we just have to make sure we're pulling one section of that social studies, and now we're teaching it in 2 languages, and we need to make sure we've got dual language staff that's available, bilingual staff that would be certified to do it, if that makes sense. And then if we're running into a scenario where we don't have certified staff, that's where you start to immediately look at retirements and making sure that the postings are in line with the needs, the upcoming needs at all of our sites. In general, I think we're continuing to strive to have as many bilingual staff members as possible. But if we know there's specific content at the high school that's going to need a specific certification, we try to look inside, see if we got it internally, and then we have to post it with an upcoming requirement. And if we run out of options, that's where we maybe back to the board and give them an update a little bit in the spring. That, hey, here's the situation. That maybe it is in high school specific in terms of certified staff where it may cause an error for a period of addition to that.
Thanks for that. I just don't want someone to think that they attended a meeting and now they're hearing this and they feel like there's conflicting messages out there about, well, wait a second, I thought they were adding some staff to serve these bilingual students, but now they're saying, with staff, we feel who was filling these spots and, teaching biology, for example, freshman biology bilingually is a spending situation where they may think, well, the biology teachers are going to be able to do that, and mom's been in place for years teaching biology and English. So it just brings up, I think, for some parents, a question about how that could possibly all shake out.
Yeah, we will know much more in the next 6 weeks in terms of course requests, upcoming attendance in March, that will really kind of have it all shaped out. But the goal would be for them to leverage retirements with postings, make sure we have the time.
I have a question about a few slides back, the comparison to our peers on students per all staff. It seems like we're slightly higher relative to our peers on that metric than we are on the just teachers to students comparison. I assume that means we have a higher ratio of non-teacher staff than our peers do. And I'm wondering I'm trying to picture what that is. Is that purely administration, or what factors into that?
Yeah, administration is actually an incredibly small number of staff members compared to the 800 plus we've got district-wide. So that would be special education systems, food service organizations, custodians, anyone that's not carrying a PPI license to do their job. So that's a pretty decent number of those, but yeah, certainly support staff, clerical, there as well.
Sorry, I just want to clarify, Joe, you said that your impression was that means we have more support staff. My impression is this means that we have fewer because the student ratio is higher. I just want to clarify.
That's probably right. That's probably where those numbers from.
We're asking.
Yeah, the way I interpreted that is that our teachers per students divided by number of teachers was potentially a little higher on the average compared to all-in staffing, which I think Joe interpreted maybe not proportionately, maybe a slightly greater number of support staff to skew that number a little bit. But to John's point, and I think we're both on the same page here, compared to the county, we still aren't really, we have fewer adults per kid, depending on the All right, anything else? All right, thank you so far. And I think we're doing as well as we possibly can. We're going to get there. All right. So now tonight, I did want to talk to the board. Per your request at our last meeting, we have been at this for about the last month to get these numbers as right as we could to at least share a scenario with the board and see if you are interested in us continuing down this exploratory road around a potential operating referendum. One thing I wanted to make sure that we surface with the board tonight is I guess two things. One, if we head in the direction of what we call an operating referendum, we reviewed this at the last board meeting. This is simply us asking for permission from our taxpayers for all of you to have additional levy authority. And just like you've done with Fund 39, you do not need to use all of that authority at any given year. If for whatever reason the state budget a year from now comes in and gives us a $500 per pupil increase, and we somehow ended up in a scenario with the tax referendum in November, the board will have the option to not use all of that additional revenue authority. And what this really is just permission from the taxpayers with some of the numbers we shared tonight for us, if the budget is tight, if the rate of inflation is higher than expected, if the needs of our buildings in line with the board's vision will change, to have the ability to manage that budget. That's simply what we're talking about tonight. Another question that's come up in everything I shared here is whether this would be a recurring or non-recurring referendum scenario. And again, it's a scenario that I'm going to work with you tonight. And what I'm going to share tonight is a recurring operating referendum, which means if we pass the referendum, share a scenario where potentially next year we get an additional $4 million of revenue authority authorized by our taxpayers, passed by our school board with an annual budget. That would stay in our base in perpetuity. If you did a non-recurring referendum, it would mean you get a $4 million bump 1 year and it disappears next year, just like federal money. That would make sense. All right. So goals of tonight to share with the board. One is budget assumptions for a 5-year scenario. Our goal and what Pete and I have built, and I Pete talk about the assumptions in a second, was to share with the board the possibility of an operating referendum where we had the option of keeping the mill rate neutral, flat, steady. So there's a scenario we'll share with you tonight where we potentially could ask for additional spending authority without the tax increase, which really, the work of previous boards, including yourself last year, pre-paying down debt related to Fund 59, has put us in a very unique position. That there aren't many districts around the state that would be able to put the presentation on tonight that we're going to do because of the work that's happened with previous boards, including yourself, relative to that management and management authority. So we're going to work through all of that. And kind of the last piece, and this is why this all ties together, we did want to share with you the possibility of, hey, 3, 5, 7 years from now, if we need to build an elementary school, we're picking up 100 students a year, what would the tax impact be if that happened? Because what we don't want to do is jeopardize, we can do a tax neutral referendum here in November, and then we're back in 2 years, and we see a big bump in Texas. And I have good news for the board tonight. That's not the case. We are really in a good position to be able to ask both of those questions sometime down the road. So I was going to have Pete, just because he did this for a living 5 years before we actually were able to get him on staff, walk us through the assumptions he built into a rather complicated chart. I'm going to walk us through here in a second.
All right, thank you, Chad. And as Chad said, I used to do this for a living. This is my normal for the last 5 years. I was working with school districts, and over the course of those 5 years, I think I had probably somewhere between 65 and 70 different school districts in Wisconsin that I worked with. And Chad was saying that we were in a unique situation. For all those school districts I worked with, I've never seen anyone quite in this situation. So it's actually a very good thing. So a I'm gonna be drawing up on the experiences that I have had while working with Forecast 5 team and use some of those experiences to help set some of our assumptions in the budget. So, well, the first thing I want to do say though is the software that we use on here, it does a projection for 5 years. And 5 years might not seem like a long time while you're doing long-term planning. However, it is a long time when you start realizing that, that's 2 state budgets. And we don't know what's even gonna happen at the next state budget, let alone the one after that. It's hard enough to know what's gonna happen next year, that budget's already passed. But, as the length of time goes on, the amount of uncertainty also increases. However, over the course of the last few years, I can get kind of a stable idea of where we think things will be, and I use some of those assumptions while we're going through it. So if we start at the very top, we look at the new funding authority. Now, Chad had talked about that. He had talked about something called a recurring referendum, and this is where what I had done in our in the financial software is plugged in a $4 million recurring referendum for next year, and then $4 million recurring after that, or for the year after that, and then $3 million and then $2 million for each of those subsequent years. So over the course of those 4 years, that's 4 plus 4 plus 3 plus 2 gives us 13. We also plugged in what we think CPI is going to do. Like I said, it's hard to tell what's going to happen in the future, and I never would have thought 4.7 would be where we're at, but hey, that's where we're at. So over the course of the next 5 years, you can see we plugged in like roughly 7% for next year, and then 6% for the year after that, and then 5% in each of those years.
Remind that last line, is that is CPI credit for your service, which is just short of the 2% raise, and increased benefit costs. So you'll actually see on the detail we do a little bit later. In the later years, it means that we're calculating a rather modest, just north of 2 to 3% in terms of the cost of it.
Thank you. Earlier, Chad also talked about student enrollment, and what we plugged into our model here is we think we're going to go up about 100 kids next year. And then in each of those future years, we plugged in 75 kids. So we'll say we'll be increasing our enrollment every year. There's also the additional state revenue authority. So we already know it's $0 for next year, the active revenue formula. But in years 2 through 5 of this scenario, we put in $100 per year. Typically, it ranges anywhere from, well, 0, as we know, or like 10 years ago when it was a minus 5.5%. It can get as high as $270 back prior to that. And finally, for additional staffing, this scenario also allowed us to add about 10 extra FTE in each year for staffing the building. Now, there's a couple notes on the bottom. One is this assumes no changes in the overall state funding formula. Typically, the state funding formula stays basically the same. I have no idea what's going to happen. Something could come around and change it quite a bit. And finally, this is also going to preserve some of the money on Fund 39 where we've been levying there, but we're still going to have a little bit of extra money that we do to levy in. There were a couple other things I wanted to add in here that aren't up on the slide. In that scenario, I also put in a 3% increase in expenses over the course of the next year, or for every year, actually, because it costs more to turn the lights every year. And finally, our property value. I put a pretty conservative property value growth in there of roughly 2.5% in each year. Typically, we're higher than that, but doing this at a more conservative number. That's all I have.
All right, and I did print this up for our board members, and there is obviously a decent amount of text, but again, tonight, we wanted to make sure you had all of the information needed for us to potentially take a next step down this path. For us to leave things out that do not feel right. So we've been back and forth with our financial consultant, PMA, a number of times over the last month, and I'm going to do what I can to work you down this slide in relatively short order. Again, you can see the increase on the top of our added number of pupils. That's our membership count. And the number that we are, just to Pete's point, putting into these assumptions, that's the top. I think that middle section is really where the board's going to want to concentrate. You can see, in particular, the bottom two lines of the middle section that say revenue limit assumptions. You can see we have built into that revenue limit assumptions a $2 million usage of ESSER funds for next year, a $1.5 million usage of ESSER funds for the following year, that's when they expire. And then the line above that is that tiered operating reference, that P reference, 4, 4, 3, and 2. Eventually giving the school board, again, the authority, this is not a guarantee in terms of levy, the authority to raise that levy by an additional $13 million by the time we work our way through that fourth year, but it's staggered in so we can level up the mill rate. That next line down is our tax levy assumptions in terms of what would happen when we do that, potentially have that increase related to that past operating referendum. You will see that those numbers don't match up perfectly. What Pete has also built in to this model is this, and this happened to us this year, a scenario where we get a little bit more stable, which means we have to tax our local taxpayers less to hit that levy number. So that's why those numbers on that levy and the increase in terms of what's going on with Fund 10 revenue don't match up perfectly, but you can see the total levy at the bottom there. And then I know our board members have continued to be interested in, and this has been really good historically in the Maroon Area School District in attempting to stabilize that number. So Pete and I took that to the extreme on this scenario. But what I'm sharing with all of you tonight is the possibility of wedging in 4, 4, 3, 2 into our operating authority and still having that mill rate stay stable at 1264 with only a modest increase in property value calculated in terms of our property value at what 2.5% a year. And we still have the possibility of doing some prepayment on that Fund 39 on the capital side. We did break apart all the different pieces that go into step increases and new hires we'll be bringing on and the cost of living, and then just kind of balance the whole thing out. So if there's a big idea from this slide, it's the fact that having a slight modest increase in enrollment, having us on track for a little bit more state aid, and that's the way we've been trending, and leveraging the prepayment in Fund 39 gives this board the possibility for just this scenario. We can bounce many different ideas back and forth with the board, but this is just one idea that we promised to bring back to all of you. The possibility of going to our taxpayers with a no rate neutral referendum ask that would give you, the board, permission to have additional spending authority related to that. There's a lot here. I think all the pre-work we've done to try to get to making this as clear as possible, hopefully got us where we need to be. Now declaring, just so we don't have a ton of, you okay with one more pause for question, because this is kind of the slide of the presentation. Do folks have questions around this slide?
I just want to clarify. So when you do a referendum, out in the public, you immediately get your properties, you're going to be paying more taxes. The question I think that we're going to get is, why have a referendum if you're not increasing our taxes? I mean, if everything's staying the same for the taxpayers, why do we have to go to referendum? And it's from the spending authority where we can spend. Can you elaborate on that in a way that makes more sense than me?
Absolutely. So the residents of the Verona Area School District gave you permission to exceed the state imposed revenue limit on the capital side with your last question. And you had a little operating risk in there, I think like $1.2 million. So when you went and asked that question, you actually have to separate them. You have to, if we were doing two questions, a capital question and an operating question. So they're two separate people. When they gave you an additional revenue authority on the capital side, you have all made a decision to, and we're going to share this with you later, eventually save the taxpayers of our community about $4 million when you prepaid down that debt. Principal and interest, we talked about that a lot. And it's also giving you the ability down the road, because of the prepayment you've done, and I've used this scenario before, you have a $1,000 mortgage payment. And we've been churning along paying $1,500 a month for 4 or 5 years, and all of a sudden we have an added expense. We're going to add uncut power to our monthly annual expenses at $1,500 a month. And instead of churning along at $1,500, now we're just doing $1,200, still doing some prepaying, and we're going to merge that power into our monthly budget. So as we're explaining this to taxpayers, you need permission to essentially merge that additional expense in, because you've been managing the mill rate all along with the authority they all gave you on the capital side to give yourself the ability to afford a new asset on the operating side that would be tax controlled. That makes sense.
It does make sense. Thank you. I appreciate it. I think that's just a point of confusion. It seems strange that you would have to ask to spend money that we're already taxing, but it's not like a household budget. You have two separate buckets.
Exactly right. We have to ask for new authority on the fund side. If it was as easy as let's do a little less prepaying and fund 39, paying down the capital, and just shuffle it over to fund 10, we could do that, but that's not actually how it works. So we actually have to ask a new separate question for fund 10 operating expenses. Yep, good question.
Can I follow up on that? So when people think of a building referendum, and I've had people ask about this, so you go to referendum, you say you're building this high school, this is now, you get permission, and they think of that for a set period of time, like a mortgage, right? In other words, that capital referendum goes however many years in the future, and then we're finally done paying off the high school campus, boom, it falls off, and we're done with that, right? So how does this kind of ask differ from that, and that you're saying it's recurring, so it's not like a building that you paid off, can you just elaborate on that?
Yeah, so it is, and again, it's additional, essentially taxing authority. So that's built into the base budget. So on our slide here where we have total levy, you can see unless something crazy happened with the state funding formula, if we were ever kind of negatively, hammered on that side per pupil, that what we built into that total levy on an annual basis stays with you. So it does not drop off like the high school scenario. It's built into the base levy, if that makes sense. So once that $4 million is in there, and we have managed that initial bump, which is prepayment on 139 with a stable mill rate, it's there. What actually happens, Christina, many districts who I think are attempting to protect our taxpayers for yo-yo mill rates, actually when the high school falls off, and Pete and I will actually share this with you, if you're a growing district, that's the time you potentially merge in some expansion, or you maintain the facilities you have to attempt to keep that mill rate as stable as possible. So you don't have a year that it dumps to 11, and then 3 years down the road you have to go to normal school and have a spike of 13. This board has done amazing work so to keep that mill rate as well as possible.
In other words, that 4 just continues on, there's not an end point.
It does, and Christina, one way to think of this is if that 4 really, and this would be when we're sharing this with our community, one of the things we talked about, that $4 million represents, we'd like to give our teachers credit for their service, and we'd like to compensate them in line with the cost of living. And once you do that at one time, it stays with you. We're not doing salary reductions the following year because it fell off. That's kind of the nature of the recurring upfront. And then those ongoing expenses on the operating side, as we projected, will continue to go up and will continue to be additional revenue for the pay for them.
Right, and just to clarify, so then when you do that the next year, again, as you're saying, you're giving them credit for service, you're anticipating the CPI of a certain amount, and that doesn't go away either. So these are like, you're adding, so it's 4, and then you're adding 4, and then so there's a cumulative effect over time.
Yes, really great questions, and you're exactly right. That's part of the reason many districts, when they go to a recurring operating referendum, structure it like this. So, one, it means we don't have to go back to the referendum ask for consecutive years. 2, if we project it, and we are, then we're going to be somewhere in the ballpark of $12 or $13 million short if things continue to go like they are over the next 4 years. That we're not in a scenario that we've got these giant holes to fill down the road with like a one-time pass type of fund. So staggering it in allows us to level the mill rate out, so it's not that one big $13 million bump on one question. And it also it kind of allows us to plan for the future and gives future boards a little bit of flexibility around the unforeseen nature of state budgeting.
I don't want to belabor this point out, but I do expect that I'll be asked about this quite a bit, and I want to be able to explain it in a way that everyone will be able to understand, in a succinct way. So I'll kind of give you my understanding, and you can tell me the things that I've done. Essentially, it stems from this, in my opinion, pretty silly notion of a revenue limit, where every district is capped at a certain amount of money they can bring in as revenue, even if, like us, we have a way that we could do it without additional taxing on our residents. So in order for us to exceed our revenue limit, even if it means no new taxes, we still have to go to the public aspect.
That is incredibly succinct.
And I got nothing wrong?
No,
That's amazing.
that is exactly right.
Okay. I have 2 other real quick, just clarifying questions about this slide. The assumptions built into this are with the stepping for staffing compensation, the step increase in the full CPI.
For next year, that is correct. Every year follow with what we projected for
assumption.
For the assumptions. So we had 469, 47. That's a real number for next year. Then we calculated 2.4, 2.3, 2.3. Okay, so fairly conservative. But then again, this is early. This is kind of to prove to the board and potentially the community that this is a conversation worth having. But we can push, you guys can push back on these assumptions all day long for us to continue to kind of massage these numbers. But this was just an initial first blush at starting this conversation to make sure we do this level of clarity.
And my last question, I'll be quiet, is can spending authority be carried over year to year?
Spending authority is very good.
Okay, so if we have 4 million in additional spending authority in 1 year, and one of our assumptions doesn't come true, and we can carry that over to a future year.
That is correct.
I have a question. I know we talked at one of our meetings, we mentioned trying not to use ESSER for one-time or for reoccurring things. So it makes sense in the previous budget, we don't really have a choice. But as we look at potential referendum options, do we have options to potentially not use ESSER or use less of ESSER on this side of the table to explore options for using it for learning, recovery, and innovation as it is
Yeah, so I certainly think that would be in play as we have these discussions over the next couple of months. So I think one thing to remember is for this upcoming fiscal year, I'm essentially asking for board permission tonight for us to move forward with at least starting the planning process around spending $2 million of ESSER funding, because we have a due date in June. So what I have to do over the next 2 months is put together a budget for ESSER 2. And many of the ongoing expenses that we've already put ESSER 3, that we already incorporated with ESSER 2, will be part of my recommended budget and will be built into the staffing workload. And we have to have it publicly available, make sure folks, if they're interested in it, come to the board meeting, actually even send a survey this spring around that budget. So that the horse is going to be out of the barn at that point, if we're heading in that direction for ESSER 3, in terms of that $2 million. We would have plenty of time to consider scenarios of pulling that $1.5 million out of these budget assumptions as far as building it into kind of a base assumption, and eventually pull it aside for one-time expenses related to something innovative. But it also, in some ways, it is, it's really just a different topic to point out. Because it's still, at the end of the day, if we pulled that $1.5 million out, we're going to have to backfill with something. And there's so many levers we have, when you put all this together, is there the possibility of an additional $1.5 million on ask in that year 2, and also deciding the mill rate, yes. So we have that money set aside, but at the end of the day, it's still a dollar related to money. Yep, I'll use it a little bit.
So just to clarify, in 2022, 23, we at least need the 2 million. And then in the following year, we can look at whether or not we need the 1.5.
That is correct.
Thank
There's exactly right. There's some nice stuff. Other questions on this slide?
I just had one further comment. Now that I at the WASB convention, I took a 3-hour session to learn more about the school funding. So I've just been nodding over here because I'm getting a double whammy of understanding of this. So thank you. I appreciate the back date too, how we get to see 2019 and then moving forward, because I have heard, even running for the board last year, the misconception around my taxes went up, look at that new building, and immediately assuming the district, right, the school is any source of increase in taxes versus being able to disentangle other reasons why folks' taxes may be going up. So I appreciate having the previous and then actually seeing that in years ahead we'd be a lower mill rate than even just a few years ago. Just to kind of keep educating the community around it isn't always the school, right, that's raising.
No, it's not, and that, and, you know, as for us to do this right over the next few months, I think all of us need to be answering those types of questions. And school funding is not an easy thing for us. I mean, we're spending, anymore 4 or 5 hours a month engaging in this, and the average taxpayer doesn't have the time to do this. But the thing that the board has control over is certainly that mill rate. That's what we end up sending relative to that tax levy. Things that are out of our control would be you put an addition on your house. You get reassessed and have been reassessed in 5 years. As a reminder, that mill rate is really, it's $12.64 for every $1,000 of property value on your house. So if you get reassessed and your property assessment went up substantially, our mill rate stayed stable, and your assessment went up, so your tax accordingly. So there's lots of moving pieces related to this. Jen, to your point, pre-referendum before that big high school, we were projecting numbers well north of 13. And right now, with this scenario, we're sitting at 1264, and these are conservative numbers. So if property values went higher than 2.5%, we would be able to start to take our mill rate down much lower than we promised pre-referendum, which is a credit to the board.
I know this slide's going to come up later, but the extra question is sitting fresh in my mind, so I just want to make more of a comment than a question. I want to make sure that we understand that the ESSER funding, think about a funding source that has community tax that's really funds what that is. Significant streams last year, there, and you use it. And also, we recover learning recovery, definitely the concern, while we all want to be progressive with innovation, that we also need to know funding. And so if you use ESSER for innovation, then the fund, we have to have a separate funding source for development after each year. And so we take the overall. That's revenue source for innovation. You know, uses, how many fields for years.
Thanks for that, Dr. Blair. Yeah, I think many of the business directors, Pete and I ran through this past week, we're having similar dialogue with the students. And some school districts have headed in the direction. We're going to hire people on federal funding because we know it's much right for the kids. And then we may end up in a situation where we have to go to taxpayers down the road in the form of a recurring referendum to keep those people on board. Or a lot of them are just going like roofs and boilers. And then 20% pulled aside for reading recovery, knowing it has to be scooped up in next year's budget. Because it is hard to spend on one thing. It just things you mentioned. All right, this is the exact rich dialogue I was thinking we were going to have. I thank you guys for this. Mary.
I just had one quick comment to make, and I just want to make sure that I agree with this. The board's been really aggressive in the past year, really aggressive in making sure that we are fiscally responsible, paying our debt, managing our budget to a way that we can justify to our community, especially when we're building such a big high school. We want to make sure that everything we do has fiscal responsibility and form. But this is the reason why. Because when a rainy day type scenario comes, we don't think anyone anticipated that there would be zero state funding and a CPI that's at historic rates. We're able to manage it. And we're able to manage it without additional cost to the taxpayer and without reducing the experience of our students. Is that?
You are spot on. That is kind of your inner Indiana.
That's how I feel.
After decades of doing it, you are exactly right. So the fact that the numbers came in better after going to high school, and things lined up as far as average student enrollment and what we had going on with state aid, all of you had the leverage to stay below the mill rate we promised, very well below the mill rate we promised, and prepay on that so we could have the possibility of doing this and keeping the mill rate stable. To Pete's point, there aren't many school districts that have put themselves in this position with some really good volume plan. All right, the end is near, and I'm hoping we got most of your questions answered. I had slightly had my crystal ball. I thought that at least you guys would be interested in continuing to explore the possibility of a low and no cost referendum asked in November. I kind of just wanted to foreshadow with the board on some potential next steps and timelines. So this kind of gets us to the end of July. The board should know that we've got kind of a middle to mid-late November election date. And legally, if we headed in this direction, the board would have to vote on language 70 days prior to that November election date. And that's, in general, not recommended to do it on the 70th day. Pete and I worked with Dr. Clary to map this towards the end of July, which gives us a little bubble. We wanted at least 90 days, preferably 120-ish, that the board is in a position that we have made the vote. Because that if we made a vote on an operating ask, then we have another 3 months to engage our public and make sure that they're as informed as possible. So we've got a timeline here for us to continue to have these conversations over the next couple months. And then we're thinking maybe mid-March, all the way through April, a series of focus groups and kind of information exchange with the community, making sure that, kind of what Joe had asked, he's already starting to get questions on this, making sure we're answering as many questions and taking input, because we would not have numbers set. We would have a couple of scenarios to share with our public. Come back, inform the board on what we've heard from the community, and I'm guessing you would be part of some of those discussions, and then we're thinking sometime in June or July, if the board decides we want to head in this direction, we have a vote. All right, and this can be relatively concise, but I promised we would do this because you're going to get this question. And, Joe, if you're having this, if you're grabbing a cup of coffee with somebody and you're in deep discussions, they better ask, you guys are a growing district, what happens if you have to build an elementary school and you used up some of that levy authority with an operating tax? So we wanted to go through kind of our enrollment process and a quick scenario around holding an elementary school. So quickly, this is our just a snapshot of the board, so you have it in your back pocket. With all of the work we've done on the capital side, we have some room in our schools, so I think it should be good news for our school board. After the boundary change, here's how we kind of set up district-wide. You will see Glacier Edge stands out there, and three board members who are with the board through referendum. Glacier has always been, it was a school that was built on the smaller side. They are very comfortable with their current enrollment. We are not projecting in the long-term big spikes in enrollment at Glacier Edge, and it's currently not a concern. I've never heard Teresa Evans say we're so tight we can't manage it. Other than that, we have room at all of our schools in the short term. My message essentially to the board is we're not going to have to ask a two-question. We're not going to have to ask an elementary school and an operating question if we have that direction and we're comfortable. But we want to make sure we do our homework. So I have previously shared the applied population-led study in terms of the overall enrollment that we're projecting in our district. We had to do some of those assumptions earlier. We are going to head in the direction of contracting services. We can do Rockers Consulting, which has done a ton of work for water already, and has vast experience with the vertical area in the school district. To make sure we have firm enrollment numbers as we work our way through the spring. I'll bring it back to all of you in March. I'm already working with Mark on that, just to make sure we have an eye on a possibility of what we might have to add some square footage. This is a lot, and we're not going to spend a ton of time here, but I want to make sure the board has it. Pete and I have spent a lot of time on this. This was one of the things that was a non-negotiable for me if I was going to bring all of you a scenario of a mill rate neutral operating referendum, was that we are planning for the future. And this is just a scenario. What this shows us is on the left-hand side, that existing debt service is what in 22 is what we owe in terms of essentially the loan on that last capital referendum. So that's Fund 39. Our minimum payment in my scenario of $1,000 minimum payment on a mortgage, we're paying $1,500. That's $11 million. This last year we paid 19. So again, we've been paying down that Fund 39. That's what gave us the possibility of this mill rate neutral referendum scenario. That is a debt schedule for that existing Fund 39 debt. Then I asked PMA to work in a debt schedule, your middle column of and we were overly aggressive on this. So but this is just to kind of prove we could do it, of a $45 million elementary school. And that's, that would be on the higher end, potentially of what could be an elementary school down the road. We merged that in just for the sake of a scenario, and this is just an example. If we went to, if we needed a new elementary school 3 years from now, if things were starting to get tight, and we went for a referendum asked at the presidential election, how we would wedge in that new bit of debt, and then on the right side, that's existing debt levy all in. So what this should tell the board, Christina asked this question before, this is essentially minimum payments that we would have to make on Fund 39. And what this has done is given us the flexibility. You guys can see as this goes down, we're like, we've got $10, $11, $12 million of levying authority that we could use on the operating side and still make payments without this scenario, quite frankly, is a mill rate neutral scenario for elementary school with an operating firm. So that potentially has us lined up for a second pass to 4 years down the road, depending on enrollment capacity to bring on an elementary school with a little to no tax impact. Which I think folks who are checking yes or no on the ballot should want to know what's next. We just had, 4 years ago, we just had a referendum pass, understanding what's going on the operating side. When can we expect to see these again? And we will have that answer this spring, but you can already start to say, we're thinking both short-term and long-term in terms of our projections for the district side. Questions on that? I tried to get through it, rather lengthy debt schedule sheet, but the big idea there was, you can see our capital debt will be tapering off. We hit a pretty big benchmark there in 2038, where the high school gets paid off, and we just had a potential elementary school.
I think that's the big question, that you'll get, if it's debt, if it's mill rate neutral, if it's tax neutral for this operational budget, what's the catch down the road? And it's nice to see, there's no catch down the road. This is a result of planning, long-term planning, so that we can keep things even for the communities so we can afford to live in this district.
That's exactly right. And Meredith, that's why that last slide was so important to me. The last thing we want is for our taxpayers to feel like they got beat, that we pulled a quick one on them, and in the short term, no mill rate, and then 2 or 4 years down the road, if our schools start to be tighter, we have to add some square footage, that all of a sudden we're back and they're like, hey, you didn't tell me about this 2 years ago. Why are we talking about it now? So I think that will have to be a conversation. If we head in this direction, quite frankly, we had in those focus group sessions, that we not only want to make sure people understand our short-term needs, but also that we're kind of in the long game and have their best interests. All right, this is really good. I knew it was going to be a lot, and you all have been amazing. I've got next steps and kind of discussion items. So you will, what we're asking for tonight from the school board is to continue to explore the possibility of an operating referendum in the fall. And again, this is just kind of just continued next steps. You likely see the next time you see us a proposed community engagement plan relative to some of these scenarios to make sure that we are embedding ourselves in the public over the next 2 to 3 months to make sure they understand the story if we have any other questions to ask. All right, so that's one. I'm seeing some nods, so I'm going to take that as a thumbs up. Next, and I haven't heard too much pushback, at least initially on this, we are looking for essentially your passive permission tonight to move forward with a staffing neutral plan. You actually eventually approved this in the form of a finalized budget, but it's good for us to kind of gauge where the board's at as we're heading our way into spring. That's at least in the short term, the direction that I'm asking for permission for us to bring the $2 million ESSER budget back to the board this spring. Dr. Clary.
Yes, I want to go back to the, you have permission to do, that nod or something. On the second bullet, especially with the community staff engagement plan, it's my desire to begin to do a referendum on the committee, knowing that we still going to vote and insurance is actually one referendum, but given this very aggressive timeline, we want to start engaging stakeholders as quickly as possible. That would also be an ask, I'll ask some members from the organization to be a part of that community as well, but I do need, as part of the superintendent's report, I think we need your permission to do. Yes.
Thanks, Dr. Clary. All right. Third bullet down was start to plan on a scenario where we build in $2 million of ESSER funds to move towards a balanced budget eventually a balanced preliminary budget. We will have a full-time plan back to the board. Eventually, we will have to approve that budget. So there's going to be a big approval that goes along with that, and seeing that that is at least a scenario we're going to have, so we're not arguing with the whole. And then just pass approval. Yep, Chad, we should figure out or retouch up the those enrollment projections to make sure that we're not going to go to school tomorrow, which we're not, but we need to make sure that that's the case. So that'll be the work of this spring, to make sure folks in the community are well aware of growth.
But I can't tell you how important that step is, and because our eyes are kind of being deceiving right now. We're seeing moving trucks and open lots every day and feel within a week. So I just want to really make sure that we have an accurate reflection of potential families and not squeezing our capacity of our.
No question, it would be very short-sighted of us to just assume we're going to be okay for the next 5 years and not get a third party to tell us that. And it was part of the reason I included that current enrollment with our school capacities, that we do have, in many cases, room for an extra 100 students in just a single school. So I think in the short term, 10-year offers is going to tell us we're in good shape, but will probably give us an idea of the window that we're going to have to start to turn around in additional elementary school.
Thank you so much for all of the details, and it's been a lot of information that is easily understood, and I appreciate you walking more through this, and this has been a huge amount of work. To be honest, I don't know if we're going to understand that, I just put it to meetings, so thank you for doing the work on budget committee and helping pull all of this together in a way that makes sense. It's complicated, and school funding, I think, is inherently illogical in some ways, but this makes sense. Thank you.
You want us down and back up for the five?
Yeah, I'm going to, it's a lot.
Yeah, I warned you.
Yeah, even though we've done it like 5 times, the driver, it's still a lot. So first, thanks to you too. As well, the significant amount of planning and meetings and numbers, and just such appreciation to, as you'll see when we present '05, every step along the way, we focused on students and our equity-based budgeting and equity-based elements for our students, and I hope you saw that in our presentation or in the verbiage. I just quickly want to state, and maybe this is me as a leader, but this should just speak. I have such a problem when we say operations and not defining who we're talking about. And we're talking about our staff and those that we trust to directly serve our children. And we have to title it operations, we have to title it capital. I just want to name in the space who we're really investing in. We're investing in those that are sacrificing their most closest, have most closest impact to our students. And we're really in essence asking our community, to your point earlier, Joe, can we invest in those that are taking care of our children on a daily basis? We see that more now than ever. We're keeping our schools open, covering classes, doing everything possible to keep our students safe and keep them happy with a world-class education. So I would throw a message if we didn't put that in the space of naming the folks on the other end that we so desire to take care of, and we really, really appreciate the pride of our voting this board and thinking about our staff and how we can invest in the future. Thank you so much. We can do the enrollment in the break, or we can do the break.
Let's take a quick break. We can
Okay.
adjourn for just a quick minute of recess, and we'll be back in, let's see, it's quarter-to-8, let's say we're back in 10 minutes. 5 minutes. Y'all have 5 minutes.
That's
Okay, are we all ready to get started again? We've got everybody there. Okay, so at our last meeting, Dr. Durkee presented us with the open enrollment proposal for 22-23 school year. And then back over to Dr. Clardy and Dr. Durkee to move on to the next board agenda item.
All right, thank you so much. I want to officially close the superintendent's report and again thank our team for a phenomenal presentation and that part as we move into the board action beginning with open enrollment. Dr. Durkee, thank you so much for your presentation of our last meeting, our superintendent's report. This one was very, we're long ways into the board meeting already, so very, very brief, just kind of overview of what you presented last time, and then we'll, I think, board will call for a vote on the enrollment.
All right. Well, thanks. Yep, as you said 2 weeks ago, I was here, I kind of talked about what the enrollment is, a little bit about trends, kind of proposal, and just a proposal for the numbers. So, the board has to vote every 4 weeks in the month of January on approving the number of students that we are able to take in for open slots, these slots. And the proposal was 115, which would be just slightly above what we had this year. And actually, we got this presentation on the budget, thinking about our resources, thinking about staff neutral potentially, and thinking about how we want to make sure not opening up for more open enrollment and we can actually fulfill those requests without adding staff into them, which is important and costly to the district. And watch those resources carefully. We feel like 115 is the right number to allow us to services rather than so that would be our proposal.
Thank you, Dr. Durkee. In that case, I'm going to ask the board if there is a motion to approve the administration's recommendation for open numbers.
I'll move.
I have a motion from Joe. Do I have a second? Second. I have a second from Yana. All in favor, signify with aye. Aye. Any opposed? This motion has passed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Durkee.
Okay, so before we move on to next is our OD5 monitoring process. I just want to make sure we're all centered in our role in this process. And just to remind the board that our focus when we're reviewing policy interpretations is on whether the interpretation reasonably demonstrates the superintendent understands the values underlying the board's policy. And when we're looking at indicators, the board's responsibility is to ensure that the indicators are measurable and are observable, and will allow us to determine whether reasonable progress or achievement that are full of being made, or actually they're in compliance with our operating qualification. Our job is to stay focused on the reasonableness. So I will turn it over to their instincts.
Thank you so much. So thank you, team, for joining me again as we prepare to present to the Board of Education OE5. I think what is both symbolic and great about this next presentation is that, in essence, you just saw 2 hours of life in our planning process. So what you hear today in the methodology of interpretation of indicators. In essence, you saw this team in the bring this to life, knowing and understanding what our Board of Education values, or our interpretation of what the Board of Education values. I also want to reframe this space and also just be very careful. I understand that sometimes it's very difficult to go between the results monitoring part of it and operations monitoring, because they are They're crucially important to our organization, but they are significantly different processes and how we do those to Board of Education. And so at our last meeting, we did a results policy, and now I'm asking you to shift your mind again and go right back to the operations policy and next. And that was excited to do because we were in results world and we were going deep into those deep indicators and beginning to think about how we're going to learn these student outcomes. And so to that purpose, I added operations, one of those key components of what you're actually looking for today. And this is operations overall, is that we want to make sure that you, the board, want to make sure that organizational performance is aligning with your board values. I've heard clearly from the first time we began working with this process that there are a lot of things that we can read, and here's what we as a board value. And I want our community to know what we value, and I want indicators that align with our values. And so that's really what this team is trying to accomplish. We want the board to understand the true, and we highlighted that potentially operational performance of the rest of VASD. Good, better, and different, you're going to be the facts. We're going to tell you what's going on. We're going to let you know if we're in the red. We'll let you know if we're in the white. We're going to let you know how we are going to fight together. We're going to let you know when it's time to celebrate, and we're going to let you know when it's time to say, oh, and just be authentic off of that. We're going to provide information that supports our advocacy of our district goals, so you can see clear alignments for our goals. And with all of our governance model, this is the opportunity to monitor our performance as a superintendent. I've asked, and the community has asked for accountability as a superintendent. You definitely have not turn on the range of meetings. It's just you're ultimately responsible for student outcomes and to implement the operational guidelines. And this is your opportunity to say, hey, I'm meeting the mark. Letting me know that and have that feedback, and also our community know, yeah, I'm meeting the mark. So the items that I'm asking for the board to accept today are reasonable interpretations of the following. Our first interpretations will be of the Board of Education value statements. Under each area of OE5, we listed a value statement. Is how I work with whether it's just listening or being at meetings or being in the presence of this Board of Education when we created the policies, my understanding of this board values. Also, I want to lift that this is one of the few times that the opening policy itself is somewhat of an adaptive leadership move because it takes intentionality in making sure that a kind of technical policy is aligned with student outcomes. That is a shift that doesn't just come from reporting mechanism, that is actually a mindset shift as well. And I know that this board values transparent and frequent communication. You're going to get sick of seeing me, Chad, Pete, and this team out here, but that's what we signed up to do. We're going to give you the information frequently and on time. Additionally, when we get to the indicators, once we get past the original policy and we start going into OE 5.1 to 5.8, they're very highly technical, very technical. And sometimes they're, as well as the board is accustomed to multiple indicators, it's really not because it's going to be one report, one budget report, or one audit report, and that's going to be the indicator whether we got it or not. And it's not that we are not transparent, it's literally one report that gives you all the information. And so that'll be the indicator. It's just maybe one few times it's just easy yes or no. I really do. What I've also learned when I think this was a little more complex, far more complex, I think, is that we want to provide information, but we notice that the deeper we got, the more processes we got. And I just realized I made more processing. That's not so we are trying to avoid processes. And so as you're asking questions, we're going to each other to begin, think about, is this process or is this actually that you're asking for? And then finally, this is the quote right from our governance model that we're all striving for. We all want to be perfect, but perfection is not the standard. The standard is reasonable. And then we provide reasonable interpretations of what we're trying to do. So with that, we're going to dig right in. So traditionally, I do not put a full policy in front of you to begin this presentation. The reason I did today is because the policy itself, before you get into the bullet points of it, really kind of stands on its own. I think it's one of the strongest policies that was built. And I wanted to make sure that this interpretation of this policy was correct, because if this interpretation is wrong, then 500 to 508 is going to be awful, and anybody else from that point. So I just wanted, that's why this is there on this slide, because I wanted to ensure that the interpretation that this Board of Education values a strategic and equity-focused multi-year budget plan that you just received that ensures fiscal sustainability, which the board has already done and enacted and expects us to maintain, and is aligned student outcomes. And so as we talked about what you heard in our budget presentation, the team intention kept bringing us back to class sizes, it's going to impact student outcomes. We're going to use equity-based approach to who's in what classes. Are we going to ensure that we look at not just numbers, but actually who's in certain spaces? And so all that aligns to student outcomes itself. So it's going to break a little bit of protocol here, which I probably something that I've asked them before, but also this interpretation is not right, then we actually call it discovery.
When I take a look at the interpretation, again, does this capture what the board values? And I think what we just discussed is captured in this interpretation. We want what we plan, which we just got. We just had a plan that is touching on the fiscal sustainability. We want to make sure that we're being responsible to our taxpayers. And then it's aligned with student outcomes. And I think everything that we just heard and appreciated hearing and retaining is captured in this interpretation, which I think the board has repeatedly reiterated as a priority. Is there anyone else that would like to add anything? John?
We're just talking about the interpretation, we're including the definition of terms.
Quick detour to this interpretation.
So with that, I feel like we're positioned to go deeper into the full document itself. But again, the more we done into OA5, this was one of those rare appearances that this opening interpretation had to be on point for us to get the already know what the documents. So with that, I'm going to actually turn it back over, open up to the board for questions about OA5 itself. As you go through, just please identify the specific number, 5.1, 2, 3, or 8. Let us know what questions you have. Me or a person on our team will be able to address those for you. And then once we've taken care of all questions, we'll put it back in.
So at this time, now, if there's any questions that are, as you know, clarifying questions about the details in the report that need to be answered by our various teams, so we have time to John, say anything?
To do definition of terms in relation to our conversation tonight about projecting out to the future. We want more than 2 years out of the future. So I'm wondering if it's reasonable that long term is defined as 2 years into the future.
So the good question is, what
That's
is
some of the first.
2 years versus 5?
Yeah, that would be, I guess.
Which definition?
I'm on the first one, OE5, just the very first set of definitions.
Definition of long term.
So your ask is to,
It would be, just, can you explain why you chose 2 years for long term versus 3 or 5?
Yeah, so to clarify, it says at least 2 years, so I think that was kind of a minimum benchmark. And I think in the world of financial planning, lots of times we work on 2-year budget windows coming out of the state. So I think we wanted to make sure we captured taking taking both, all the information that we possibly have on an individual budget cycle into account. We certainly can push that number if we, so we're so inclined to Pete's point earlier, John, anytime you're past even that 2-year mark, it starts to become a little bit of a leaky board. Because we only know what's in the next 2-year budgets, even when we start, let alone what's going to happen with, enrollment. You go all the way down the list in terms of what we're doing per pupil and everything else. So we thought that was the lowest possible threshold was at least 2.
Thank you. Any other questions? Mr. Booker?
I have a question about, all the way at the end, only this is just I think a simple clarifying. It's on the indicator, is that the year-end financial statement verifies that the ending fund balance is at least 10% of the budgeted expenditures. Does that mean the budgeted expenditures from that just ended?
Pete, we can help clarify the technicality of time, and I think that's literally the definition of fund balance.
Yeah. Yes, that is correct. That is of the same year that we're discussing.
Okay, good, thank you.
Okay, any other questions? I know this is one where it is, the overall interpretation is the big meat of the rest of this, because it does start to get really technical, very quickly, the interpretations being very specific to, so I think this is one, are there any other questions? Go ahead, Jen.
It's on 45.7. The definition of conservative projected says utilizing research of historical financial trends. And then the indicator is just that the budget is passed. And I'm wondering if that definition requires an indicator like part of the budget that's presented includes that historical data, like what we saw today. I believe that's mentioned elsewhere, and I haven't looked through it, but I just wanted to ask that.
Can I add to John's question quickly? Because I had a question about that indicator too, about an indicator that says the board passes the annual budget. My question really is just to be educated on this point, having not been on the board for a budgeting process. Does the board not have to ultimately pass our budget at some point?
Yes, we can absolutely not go to it.
Okay.
So I think this would be one where if the team came to us with a budget, and was like, okay, we're gonna ask you to run the budget, let's get this over here, $1 million for that, we would probably not get compliance with this, and we would definitely not pay for that budget. So I think that's where it's in.
But in that scenario, wouldn't they then come back to us with a revised budget that we may ultimately approve and do? So I think what I'm trying to get at is, don't we want an indicator that factors that in somehow? Whether, we ultimately pass the budget, but in the early budget stages, we do. And I'm just trying to work this out. And I didn't mean to interrupt John's question. It's just, yes, similar.
Or if like there's a board that passes a budget that might not reasonably be considered to be conservative. I guess I'm just getting at, then you can say you're in compliance, but you're still.
I don't think it's saying the budget would be conservative, what you're saying is a conservative projection, basically, budget projections. So I think, again, we have to go back to the OE, with the OE as a whole. And I think, what I think Jill said, if you don't want this to happen the first time around, so I think that should be clear.
So my recommendation would be look at the interpretation of this one. Look at the interpretation of the board, budget provides an annual budget planning process that ensures long-term financial stability. Everything that we presented today, what fits, that is what this board has historically done, has provided evidence to this team that they want us to do. So in alignment with that interpretation, we evidence that our indicator that indicate that interpretation is correct, that you pass the budget. honest, being very transparent, the indicator list, originally this was about 60. And they were all processes. They were every single one of these processes. It was the process of going back and forth. It was a process.
Yes, yes, yeah.
And then for that, just make everyone, switching to reasonableness and indicators, but when you come back to model this, we were looking at this and we had passed, and we had 3 budgets to get the full before we actually passed it, that would be considered in model, right? So it would be inherently captured in the.
I mean, I'm not sure if I used to, but why aren't you agree with what before?
If we voted down,
Yes.
yes, there's a reiteration of
And so I think those are, John and Joe, those are very, very valid questions that we just work grapple on, that this team, we set out and grapple a lot each and every time. It was a process. That's a process. So when we come back to you, the biggest indicator of success is the power of the communication. So yeah, inherently do communications.
I'm not sure that's a safe assumption.
I do, I think it is.
I'm not joking.
I think it's
You're
smart.
in different boards, not, it might not always be a safe assumption.
I think it would be respectful to boards that are comfortable with and boards that we are now, and I think that we have, the administrative high level, so responsibility. So I think from that point, that's judging us, not the judging ones for the administration side, that's not there. Any other questions? Again, these are very technical, and I think it was, actually, it's helpful to read these now, especially having had such a detailed presentation that aligns with so many of these things, just before this. And I think as we go through, year of monitoring, a lot of the interpretations and indicators are going to come away with the way for us to make it do right now. We look at the processes through the different things that we're still looking at. So if there's any more questions, please. And seeing no more questions, please. Okay, John.
One more question, the indicator on OE 5.2 in the adopted prior budget was in compliance with statute 65.9. I mean, I read, when we looked through these, I went and read the statute, and I'm still a little unclear as to what that does and how it relates to this notion of credibility. What is that? What is it that we're saying there? What does that indicator tell us exactly?
So again, I would jump down to the interpretation. That statute is the legal stance of budget requirements. So we are stating that our credibility is that we have not violated the laws. We have held to the standards of budget that state Wisconsin expects us to perform. And so if we go back to the interpretation, we believe that the Board of Education values budget reports that are ethical, which synonymously understandable and transparent. And if we look at the evidence of the board presentation that we just gave you, we felt like we met all those requirements of the financial planning that we presented. The statute itself is in essence the law. So we want to make sure that we provide you with
No, you explained it very well.
Are there any clarifying questions for Secretary and Chairman? Otherwise, we can move to the board to discuss the reason this.
I just have another question about that. That seems to be the place where I would expect something about the auditing process, not like that it's a process itself, but like one indicator would have something to do with the auditor's report, reflecting that this was verifiable. That is a verification, right? budget goes through.
John, if I remember correctly, we have a week already that talks about compliance with our audit. I think we have one that says our audit will come back clean, essentially,
Okay.
that we've already.
This does bring up a question that I had it says will be determined to be in compliance with statute by, I assume by the auditors, in whose opinion is it compliant with the statute? The auditors?
Yeah, on the, we put as an indicator to the board of education that our audit activity.
Okay, so we as a board aren't expected to look at the budget, look at the statute, and make sure they line up.
No, we will provide evidence of audit. So also this would be an opportunity where you would see, in the monitoring report as evidence, you would see that audit in that OE, you would also see it in this OE as well.
I think it's 6.
Okay.
Sometimes it's people rather be something like that. Until then,
So John, just so that it says in 6.6, the external audit contains a fiscal year report of receipts and expenditures of each fund with designated program reports per state statute 651.
Right, my question was that, does that, because here we're asking for our budget to be credible, are we also then asking for there to be some sort of, like, that says that there shall be an audit that accounts for these things. My question is, are we supposed to specify that that audit has to show that it was close? That doesn't necessarily say that.
So I think we're kind of crossing over into the area of reviewing interpretations of reasonableness, and rather than clarifying with the team any questions that we have that asking. So are there any other questions that we need to ask the team about? And maybe, I think the audit is one where we want some clarity on how that will impact, that would be your question. That's where you're headed. I'm not sure to fully understand your question.
So that to me says that we will have an audit. This doesn't say anything about an audit. So I'm wondering, do we need to say something? This is maybe a question for us, maybe it's a question of reasonableness. Is it reasonable to expect that there's somewhere where we say the audit should show that what we budgeted for was kind of close or something? I don't know.
I think that's the board to discuss, because again, I think that's the particular that is the, we actually asking for that. Any questions for the team? Otherwise, we're gonna, the board, move this to documents. In case, we'll be here just in case we jump back. All right, so at this point, I'm going to ask for a motion to accept and approve the interpretations as indicators as presented, so that we can begin the board's discussion on the reasonableness of the presented information. So I have a motion from Yana, do I have a second? Yes. Okay, the second from Joe. And at this point, we can now discuss the reasonableness of the interpretations of the indicators. Again, reasonableness standard. We're not looking for perfection, but we're looking for, can we judge whether the district is in compliance with our expectations with these indicators? And I want to start again at the very first, at the overall interpretation. I think this does capture what the board has been consistently saying about our finances, and has demonstrates that there is an understanding of the board's values. I do want to make sure that the rest of the board is fully on board with that as we move forward, because I think this does touch everything else that we're going to talk about moving forward. Seeing that,
Or again, we're talking about just the interpretation of the definition of funds.
you're talking about just the interpretation.
Not 5.1.
Just
The
five.
overall,
Just fine. Okay, got it.
Yeah. So as we move on, looking at the subparts. I want to make sure that we are looking again at reasonableness of interpretations, and knowing that the interpretations are strict, they're all stemming from the overall policy. There are subparts then of the overall, and the indicators get us to a place where we're able to judge compliance with this specific subpart.
So John, I just wanted to mention that there are other parts of 6 that I do read, because it's, that do cover that, like, the receipts show that everything is in compliance and all of the other stuff as it relates to our audit. But I do think get at what you're looking for the 5.2 indicator.
Awesome.
So let's go to, does anyone have any questions about 5.1, or are we, with the reasonableness of the indicators and interpretations of 5.1? Yeah?
Again, so earlier, I mean, I still have a concern about the way long-term is defined. But I don't think that 2 years is, and I get that it says at least 2 years.
So I think we're looking again at the reasonableness, we wasn't meant to judge whether or not 2 years based on the fact that the state budgeting process is 2 years, and really, it's going to be very difficult to project beyond the 2-year budget and sort of write in and whatever, kind of whether or not it's reasonable. And then it was 2 years, at least 2 years, so it. Does anyone else have concern about that, or can we continue on? Okay, 5.1, any questions, concerns there?
I'm just curious, is indicator B the same as the other indicator, or are they supposed to be the same? Wasn't there another one that says the forecast? 5.7?
I had the same question, Brian. Here it says by majority vote, I think the other place it just says passes.
I mean, I don't think it's a big deal, but I'm just curious if there's a difference, which I guess I should have asked that. But is there a difference in us adopting the proposed budget by majority vote and then passing the budget, or?
There's going to be iterations of budgets that are going to come to us several times throughout the year. And there's going to be the final budget, and it's like, we will. But
So just so I'm understanding that we might be, so like this year we'll pass a budget that you propose, we'll vote for that one, but then it may change if other referendum was to pass, it would be a new budget. Okay.
Well, and maybe then just in general, an indicator be the same. I mean, yeah, right, like fundamentally, I don't think that matters, right? That, past budget could be the indicator for a lot of these.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure there wasn't a difference between the two.
Sure.
One
and
is,
proposed,
yeah.
So just a clarification from, we're not
We're not,
I don't know if you're asking us.
we're good right now.
Yeah, we're good. And Chad and Pete are nodding their heads, so that's all the.
Okay, so let's look at 5.2, any questions from the board on 5.2, about the reasonableness of interpretation of the indicator? All right, I'm going to move on to 5.3, any questions there from the board? All right, well, we're getting too slowly. Continue to speed things up. 5.4. Any questions on 5.4? 5.5?
I'm gonna need you to slow down, I can't. Because I'm gonna make us go back.
I'm sorry, but anyway, well, can I have my notes on this? Yes. Let me know if I'm being back up.
I have a lot of
All right, well, I'm going to keep going. If you stop, let me know. So this is 5.5, anything? I think, indicator one, like, if I can highlights the, as this is all going to be, these are all pieces of the whole. I know that one of the questions that we had at one point, involved staffing comparisons, and here we're seeing kind of that question from the previous OE is actually tied into the relevant place later. I think that's just a good thing to the board to recognize that, not everything is going to be done all day, one day. It's going to be parsed out into, different pieces. You know, we just a reminder to me, so I have one more question about that, really, so. 5.6. Seven. 5.8. Okay, so we've kind of gone through, for interpretations and indicators, and any questions about reasonableness. I like to hear the board does not have questions about reasonableness of the indicators and interpretations that have been presented. If there are, raise them now. And if anyone feels like we have to hash them out, we can move forward. Some nods. Okay. In that case, let's move to a vote. We have a motion, and a second, motion by Yana, and a second by Joe, I believe. And in that case, let's move to a vote. So all in favor of approving the indicators and interpretations as presented, with an aye. Aye. Any opposed? The indicators and interpretations presented have been presented. Thank you very much for your work.
Thank you, team. And thank you for your work coming into this as well as the questions today. And also I want to acknowledge our team for the continued work in putting these together. And we know we have funding enough governance model. First year will be complex, but I feel like it's going to use those smooth outcomes for us. We're pleased with that. Knowing that.
At this point, Chad, you probably feel like they should have their own name tags on the board. Thank you so much. It's been a very fun presentation for you tonight, so we appreciate your time and all of the work that you made to the presentation and then the evaluation. It's much appreciated.
Our pleasure, thank you.
Thank you.
I believe our next one will be results. Yeah. Results next. Yes.
You're right, it's hard to result with that, always reasonable progress versus compliance. All right. The next item on the agenda is public comments, where if there's any members of the public that are here that wish to address the board on any topic, they are welcome to do so at this time, but I do not believe we have any members of the public here. So in that case, we'll move on. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, do we have anything over email for public comment?
Okay, and we'll move on to the superintendent consent agenda. There's personnel items on the agenda and payment of bills. I know the superintendent consent agenda, I did just want to note that on your retirement, Principal Ann Principal, who has put in 31 years of service, I just want to say how grateful we are for her time in the district and all of the work and her impact on students going long into the future. Are there any questions about the superintendent's consent agenda?
Can I just quickly shout out to that person as well.
Yeah.
She's one of the first leaders that I've advocated to the district. Just a strong advocate for students, strong advocate for staff, and tireless worker. And I didn't ask her, do we always have to accept retirement? Apparently we do.
I think technically we do, but we can do it with great sadness. In this case, usually we do that. Yes.
So just wanted to acknowledge her.
I just want to add to that as well. She's been the principal for my kids for a number of years, and just very grateful and appreciative for everything she's done.
She will be missed, absolutely. Okay, so hearing no other comments and questions, and we have the rest we do have to resolution, whether you like it or not, we do wish you all the way to retirement, and superintendent's consent agenda has been passed. The board's consent agenda has our meeting minutes from January 10th. Any questions about that? Any concerns? Hearing none, the board's consent agenda has also been passed. Our next item on the agenda is the future agenda item. We'll take a look at the dates and times. And I just want to make a mention that since we do have different locations, make sure you're checking the board agenda. And I will read it and send out an email, just much appreciated. And I, for the public, it's always on the agenda of the locations.
Question about the March 21st board meeting date, that's during spring break for the district, correct? Is that happening or not?
I'd say that probably need to reschedule. Okay, we are going to amend our future meeting dates, and how about we come back at the next meeting and we'll have a list of reasons.
Sure, I'll still be able to do that.
Yeah. Thank you for letting that, since I will spring break. The whole wayside, spring break happens about the hearing, I did not notice it.
In my work, I know the spring break of pretty much every district in the county, so.
It's happened, all right.
And they're all different.
Okay, the next item we have on the agenda is a board debrief, and again, I feel like our admin team has been here now again for another over almost 13-hour day at this point, probably longer. I think our board meetings are, if we just want to do like a quick, what we think we did best over the week in this meeting, let's do this in like 3 or 4 minutes or less. And around robin. And, you know, I can start this off by saying, I feel like we focused in on the substance of the heavy-duty budget discussions and state budget. Got it? How do you do?
I also agree, I think you did a good job with a very technical subject.
Jen?
I felt that we did pretty well not belaboring things.
Joe?
Yeah, I like the format of having question slides built into language presentations. So it made us kind of hold our questions and not be relevant.
Yeah.
Good feedback, yes. Jen?
I think we all came adequately prepared, and I thought the questions that surfaced tonight were genuinely because of the engaged part of a presentation that I know for myself, I can't get from alone. So I appreciate being able to look through things, but then have the more responsive questions.
Thank you all for the quick debrief, but I think it was a valuable one. And your feedback. And in this case, I'd like to adjourn the meeting if I have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Motion from Jen,
Second.
Where did that come from?
Yeah, gotta get in the minutes to see that.
Okay.
Up to my mind, burn it.
That's right, I didn't see. All right, so a motion and a second, all in favor of adjourning, please, say aye. Aye. We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone, for your time tonight.
Bye.
Thank you.